Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about emotion. We are going to be discussing what is happening in our brains and what is happening physiologically while we experience emotion. And then we are going to talk about the different theories related to emotion and why we think they exist and what their purpose is and all of that kind of stuff. But before we can get into the more psychological debate over the purpose of emotion, we do have to start with just like physically what's happening in our bodies when we're experiencing emotion. So most psychologists agree that there are three aspects of an emotional response. Those aspects are bodily arousal, which is your physiological aspect, the expressive behavior or your behavioral aspect, and your conscious experience or your cognitive aspect. And it's important to note that like psychologists do think that you have all three of these when you're experiencing an emotion, because like an emotion like sadness is different than a feeling like, cold. Both feeling cold and feeling sad have an element of like physiological arousal that is there, but there is something else about emotion, because none of us would say that feeling cold is an emotion. We would all say that feeling sad is. So, what else is happening besides just the physiological arousal? That being said, the start of emotion is physiological. When we talk about bodily arousal, we are talking about the activation of the autonomic nervous system. So that is, your fight or flight response back from Unit 3. So things like your pupils dilating, your mouth salivating, starting to sweat, breathing heavily, your heart rate going up, the release of adrenaline. And obviously not every emotion makes you have this like full-blown physiological response, but emotions will make you have some level of this. And on top of the bodily arousal, you have your expressed behavior. So you have like, what do you do because of that bodily arousal? Do you punch somebody? Do you run away? Do you start crying? Do you jump up and down in excitement? Do you laugh? So you have this bodily arousal that's happening, and then you have this behavior that goes with it. And your behavior is going to change based on the emotion. If something is funny, you're not going to punch someone, right? If something is sad, you're not going to start jumping up and down in excitement. So the expressed behavior is adding this psychological layer of not just the arousal, which is the same no matter what the emotion is. Like the autonomic nervous system response is always the same, but being able to differentiate that arousal as anger versus sadness versus happiness, etc. And then you have your conscious experience or your cognitive aspect, and that's what are you thinking? And it really has to deal with like, how are you labeling your emotions? It's basically saying I'm scared, I'm happy, I'm sad. So it's the thought processes that kind of match the bodily arousal and the expressed behavior together, if you will. It's kind of like a bridge between the two. Okay, so just as a quick reminder, physiological response, it comes from your autonomic nervous system. If you don't remember from Unit 3, the autonomic nervous system is split into two, your sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. The sympathetic division is the one responsible for the fight or flight response, so that's the one that produces physical arousal, like, heart racing, hyperventilating, sweating, etc. The parasympathetic division is responsible for calming you down after a stressful event, so it's the one that's going to slow your heart rate, stop the sweating, slow your breathing, all that kind of stuff. And here, again, just as a like reminder of what the sympathetic or arousing side does, what the parasympathetic or calming side does. Sympathetic will dilate your pupils, decrease salivation, cause sweating, increase respiration, accelerate your heart rate, inhibit digestion, and secrete stress hormones. The parasympathetic just basically reverses all of those. It does the opposite. So it'll contract your pupils, increase salivation, stop sweating, decrease respiration, slow your heart rate, activate digestion, and decrease the secretion of stress hormones. Okay. So What else is happening in the brain? So we know we have this autonomic nervous system piece. We know that we have this cognitive piece, which is definitely going to come from your frontal lobe. But you also have other areas of your brain that are activated when you're experiencing emotion. So, physical responses, like what it is mentioning at the top there, like, the movement of your facial muscles, your temperature, like stuff like that is all going to change related to the emotions that you're feeling as well. And a lot of that has to do with two areas, the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens. The amygdala is the one that we are more familiar with. In that it shows the differences in activation, like when you are using an fMRI on somebody, I should say, you're going to see different levels of activation when somebody's experiencing anger or rage. And then you'll see more activity in the left hemisphere if somebody's happy. You'll see more activity in the right hemisphere if somebody's depressed. So, we do see these other areas that are involved in our experience of emotion. Okay, so most people also agree that there are kind of 4 areas of emotion. And if you're using the note guide, I think I just put a version of this image in the note guide really big so you could kind of take notes around it. But we basically believe that you have these 2 different axes. You have whether the emotion is a pleasant experience or an unpleasant experience, and then you have the amount of physiological arousal. So if your fight or flight response is in full-blown activation mode, you're going to be on this high arousal side. And if it's just kind of mildly activated, you barely even notice it, you're going to be over here. And then depending on what what quadrant you're in, that is how we kind of label different emotions. So if you have a pleasant emotion that also is low arousal, you're going to feel peaceful, relaxed, tranquil. You're going to feel good. You're going to feel happy. It's a pleasant emotion, but you're not going to have that pounding heart, craziness. If you're experiencing pleasant emotions with a high level arousal, then you're going to be ecstatic, enthused, energized, surprised. It's going to be running into your favorite movie star at the mall and, that surprise and excitement of seeing them, right? That's a lot different than I feel very relaxed because I just meditated for a half hour, despite the fact that both of those emotions would be considered pleasant. And then on the bottom side, you have your unpleasant emotions, again, separated by high arousal and low arousal. So low arousal and pleasant emotions are going to be sad, depressed, sluggish, tired, stuff like that. Whereas your high level unpleasant emotions are going to be angry, scared, nervous, worried, where you have a little bit more of that pounding heart and physical arousal. So we know all of this to be true. These are kind of your basics, your foundations of what a scientist could say in regards to emotion. But psychologists always have a little bit more of that philosophical debate going on over who experiences emotion and how and why and all that kind of stuff. So there are 3 major competing theories about what changes a physical perception into an emotion. And I am going to go through them one by one, but I'm going to stop here and show you a SciShow video that talks about them. I think that the video gives some really good examples and some good touchstones that I will refer to as I go through the different theories in the rest of the lecture.
Think back to the last time you had a feeling all the feels moment. Maybe it was when you finished reading this really great book about, I don't know, 2 teenagers with cancer who fall in love, and it basically ripped your heart out, and what, I'm not sobbing, you're sobbing. Or maybe it was when you got engaged, or that day when everything went wrong. Whatever it was, it gave you some really strong feelings. But how did you know what you were feeling? Feeling that something is hot or cold or a soft, fluffy kitty makes intuitive sense. You're touching a physical thing, and it's going to feel a particular way. But emotions are way less straightforward. So where do they come from? Let's just say the psychologists have all the feels about that one. Even defining emotion is tricky. Like, we all know that cold is a feeling and that it isn't an emotion the way sadness is. But it's hard to explain the difference. So one of the things psychologists tried to do is identify a few key parts of experiencing emotion. There's obviously the part where you feel, along with a cognitive piece, which involves being aware of the feeling. There's also something motivational, like when fear makes you want to run away from a giant hairy spider in your basement as fast as your legs will carry you. Then there's a physiological response, like the racing heart and sweaty palms that accompany said fear. And there's a motor response. Say when you do actually hightail it out of there. The debate is really about which of these components are part of the emotion itself and which are a cause of it or a consequence of it. It's kind of a chicken and the egg situation. What causes what, and is there an order in which things happen? Over the years, psychologists have come up with a bunch of different theories about this. The James Lange theory, proposed in the late 19th century, says that a physiological response happens when you perceive something, and the emotion is your reaction to that response. So it's not that you cry because you're sad. You're sad because you cry. This is actually pretty similar to a more recent theory known as the facial feedback theory. It argues that the way you're holding your facial muscles when you make facial expressions can actually cause you to feel emotions more strongly. But there were a lot of criticisms of the James Lange theory. The biggest problem was that particular physical responses don't always indicate the same emotions. You can tremble from fear, sure, but also from rage or from cold. So how do you tell which emotion is supposed to come from the physical response? Maybe you're just really super angry at that spider. The Cannon-Bard theory, which was proposed in the 1920s, was pretty much a rebuttal to James Lange. It argues that emotional responses are too fast to be the result of a physical reaction that happens first. Instead, it suggests that the physical response and subjective experience of emotion happen in parallel at the same time. When you first see the spider crawling out from the corner, sensory information about the encounter arrives at your thalamus, a region of the brain involved in coordinating signals. Then the thalamus sends out a signal to your peripheral nervous system that triggers all the physical stuff and also sends the signal that triggers all the feels. That would explain why the physical response happens at the same time as you feel the emotion. And if there's separate signals, it would also explain why trembling when you're cold doesn't necessarily make you afraid. But neither of those ideas, that emotions follow a physical response or that they happen in parallel, say anything about how your actual thoughts play into all of this. That's where the two-factor theory of emotion comes in, also known as the Schachter-Singer theory, after the researchers who first proposed it in the 1960s. The idea is that we use circumstances to attribute our physical reactions to certain emotions. Those are the two factors, your physical response and how you label it. If your heart's pounding and that spider's ominously crawling towards you, you know to interpret that as fear. But if your heart's pounding because you've just been to the gym and there's no spider, then you're probably good. No fear necessary. To put their theory to the test, the researchers injected people with adrenaline, then put them in situations that were either supposed to make them laugh or make them feel super frustrated and angry. Subjects who knew that the adrenaline would give them a racing heart and sweaty palms didn't report feeling any emotion because they blamed their reaction on the drug. But if they didn't know, they attributed feeling all jumpy to the situation they were put in, hilarious or upsetting, and reported feeling real emotions associated with those scenarios. In the decades since Schachter and Singer first proposed their idea, researchers have come up with other cognitive theories of emotion too. Some of them aren't as focused on interpreting a physiological response. Instead, they argue that your emotions depend on what you think the impact of a situation will be. For example, you might get angry when you judge that you've been treated unfairly. So there are lots of different theories for how our emotions work. But it's hard to know whether any of them can fully explain how and why we feel the things we do. Emotions are just messy, and whatever objective measures of emotion you might want to use in experiments, like heart rate, don't always line up with what someone's actually feeling. But the next time you run into that spider in your basement, at least you'll have some idea of how your feelings might be connected to your physical response and cognition. Something to think about while you're running back up the stairs. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow Psych. If you're interested in learning more about the mix-ups that can happen when you feel emotions, you can check out our episode about how you can sometimes mistake fear for love.
Okay, so if you're using the note guide, we're going to be looking at this graphic organizer that walks through the three theories you just heard about in the SciShow video. The James Lange theory, the Cannon-Bard, and the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory. If you are not using the note guide, I would encourage you to set up like a page in your notebook similar to this, where you have the order in which things are experienced or recognized, because that's the easiest way to kind of keep track of the different theories. So you have your stimulus up here, which could literally be anything, but a common one that we use when we talk about this is, a near-miss car accident to the side of an oncoming car. And in the case of James Lang, you have your physical arousal followed by an emotion. In Cannon-Bard, you have your, this should say emotion here. I apologize, everybody. Your physical arousal and emotion at the same time. Or, yeah. Geez, I'm an idiot, and I just, never changed the wording here. I'm sorry about that. And then for the two-factor theory, you should have physical arousal and cognition, and then emotion here. You'll see that on the slides as we're talking about it, so you can, cross these out and write down what they should be. But I apologize for just copying and pasting and forgetting to change the wording. So yeah. Okay. Now we'll get into it. Okay, so here we have the James Lang theory, and you have it kind of laid out here, obviously horizontal instead of vertical though. But the James Lang theory is the theory of emotion that you have your emotion-provoking stimuli. So the example we're going to be using is the side of an oncoming car. And that stimulus produces your physiological response. It produces the pounding heart and the sweating and the rapid breathing. So it causes that sympathetic nervous system arousal. And then because you experience that, you have the consequence, which is an emotion. So the whole idea is that we feel sorry because we cry. We feel angry because we strike, and afraid because we tremble. And that's a quote from William James, who is obviously one of the authors of this theory. So in this point, the key thing to keep in mind is that according to this theory, the emotion is a consequence of the physical arousal. So they don't happen together. One happens and then the other comes after. And that is, like the video kind of addressed, something that a lot of people more recently have had some issues with. But there are still some, some good sort of ideas behind this particular theory, that the physical arousal, again, causes the emotion. The emotion is the consequence. Your second one is your Cannon-Bard theory. So again, I apologize for having physical arousal on your graphic organizer twice. One of them should read emotion. But the Cannon-Bard theory, it came out in the 1920s as a direct contradiction to the James Lang theory. They looked at this James Lang theory that was stating that fear is a consequence of physical arousal, and they said that doesn't make sense, that the physical arousal and the emotion have to happen simultaneously. So the idea here is that the emotional feeling and the physiological response, you can't have one without the other, and that the emotion and the behavior and the physiological experience happen simultaneously. Their main argument for this is the quickness of some emotions. So if we take that example of the sight of an oncoming car, that really gives us this kind of idea of do you have enough time to experience the physiological arousal and have the emotion be a consequence of that? Or, is it so quick that it's happening together at the same time? And that's kind of the difference here. James Lang would say that, in the moment when you're just trying to get out of the way of the oncoming car, hold on, got to take care of the dog. Sorry about that. Had to take care of the dog. So in the case of the Cannon-Bard versus the James Lang theory, the difference would be that James Lang would argue that when you see the car coming at you, your instincts are going to take over and you're just going to get out of the way of the car and you're going to have that physiological arousal. And once you're safe, you'll kind of sit back and be like, wow, I'm scared. That was scary. And the emotion therefore comes a few seconds or a few minutes later. Cannon-Bard would argue that while you're trying to get out of the way of the oncoming car, you would feel that fear, that you would know that you are scared and this is a scary situation, and it would be happening at the same time as that physiological arousal. And then finally, the Satcher-Singer two-factor theory of emotion. This to me is the one that makes the most sense. Like a lot of theories in psychology, it's kind of difficult to prove definitively that one thing is correct and one thing is wrong when we're dealing with like conscious experience in the mind and stuff. That being said, this one kind of makes the most sense to me. And again, I apologize that you just have physical arousal 3 times. You should have physical arousal in one of the boxes here, and then you should have the phrase cognitive label. And then after that, you should have your emotion. So here we have the same stimuli, the sight of the oncoming car. And the difference between Satcher Singer and Cannon-Bard and James Lange is this idea that you have to be able to label the emotion before you really experience it. And the argument for this theory is this idea that the physiological arousal is always the same. You know, your fight or flight response is not different when you're feeling happy versus sad versus angry. Like it's always the same experience of physiological arousal. So how do you differentiate the pounding heart that you get from being asked out on a date to the pounding heart that you get when you almost get hit by a car, right? Like, how do you know that one is fear and one is happiness? And the 2-factor theory would argue that you have this cognitive label, that you have to think about the situation. So you take into the effect, like, I'm feeling something, my heartbeat is going crazy, I'm hyperventilating, like something's going on. But then, like, think about the situation. Am I, looking at my significant other sitting on one knee with a engagement ring out? Or am I behind the wheel of a car, driving 80 miles an hour with a semi-truck coming right at me? And based on the context of what else is happening, I can label the emotion as either fear or happiness. So that's kind of the basis here. You have your stimulus, you have your physiological arousal, which is the same no matter what emotion you're experiencing. And then you think about the situation. You kind of take a look around you and figure out, is this a happy situation, a sad situation, a scary situation? You label your emotion and then you feel it. Obviously, this all happens fairly quickly. But it definitely explains the idea that, like, in one situation, a pounding heart can mean excitement and enthusiasm, and in another situation, a pounding heart could mean, fear or dread. Yeah, so to me, this one seems to make the most sense from that perspective. And then we're going to look at the 3 of them comparatively. So this is kind of what you have in your note guide. I just tried to fit it on one page and then obviously labeled it a little bit weird. But James Lange, you have your stimuli, which causes a response, and the result of the physiological response is an emotion. Cannon-Bard, you have your stimuli, which causes the emotion and the response at the same time. And then the 2-factor theory, you have your physiological response, you have your cognitive label, and after you've labeled the emotion, then you experience fear. In the SciShow video, they talked about the experiment of the people being injected with adrenaline, and those that knew that they were injected with adrenaline did not acknowledge that they felt an emotion because they weren't cognitively labeling that physiological response as an emotion. They were labeling that physiological response as a result of the adrenaline. In a group that didn't know that they had been given adrenaline, they changed their cognitive label. They didn't say, like, oh, I'm feeling this because of, being given a drug. They labeled the emotion that they were supposed to, whether that was like laughter or anger or whatever. So those are your different theories of emotion. And now we're going to get into how we express emotion and what that looks like. One of the ways we talk about experiencing emotion is the facial feedback hypothesis, which was also mentioned in the SciShow video. There is some evidence that changes in your facial muscles can cue the brain to cause certain emotions. Like if you smile, you'll feel happy. If you're frowning all the time, you'll feel a little bit more sad. And there is, again, like some fMRI evidence that this is true and that we can physically change how we experience and express emotion based on, like, how we hold our face. And that's, kind of, it's considered like almost a theory of emotion. It's not quite, considered a theory the same way Satcher Singer and James Langton Cannon-Bard are, but it is definitely considered like something that changes or affects the way we experience emotion and therefore the way that we express it. So that's the facial feedback hypothesis. Now we're going to talk about two very specific psychologists, Carol Izard and Robert Plutchik, both of whom spent their careers studying emotion, and both coming up with different kind of bases for how we experience and express emotion. So if you're looking at the note guide, you have Carol Izard and Robert Plutchik on the same page, and then you have a couple of images. There is some things you need to make sure you include under each person's name, so I'll make sure to point that out. So our first person, Carol Izard, she is famous for identifying basic emotions in infants. So her idea in trying to figure out like which emotions exist in humans was to look at babies. And her hypothesis was that infants only have like instinctual or naturally occurring emotions. They wouldn't necessarily know how to express like complex emotions that come through learned experiences because they haven't had those learned experiences yet. So she studied infants and identified what she considered to be 10 basic emotions that form like the foundation for our entire emotional response. And those 10 emotions are fear, anger, joy, disgust, interest, surprise, contempt, shame, sadness, and guilt. And like I said, these are just like a foundation for our emotions. The more complex emotions that we feel, like depression or love or hope, are combinations of these basic emotions. So for example, love, according to Carol Izard, is a combination of joy and interest. So infants start with these base emotions, and as they learn more about their world and how they experience it, they learn how to combine the different base emotions into a more complex emotional experience. One of the primary ways that she did this is by studying these pictures of babies and kind of identifying different facial expressions as the different emotions. And you should have this image or one kind of like it in your note guide. But you have, joy, this clearly happy face, which is usually signaled by like the way the eyes look and the way the mouth looks. You have anger, which is also usually seen in the mouth and the eyes and the eyebrows a lot, that you have this kind of scrunched up face and scrunched up mouth. You have surprise, which is largely in the eyes. That surprised face usually comes with like really big eyes. You have your disgust face, which is that kind of scrunched up face that we all get when maybe you like take a bite out of a lemon or something. You have a surprised face, which is a little bit more, it's similar to interest. It's also similar to happiness, where you have your brows raised, you have wider eyes, you have a wider mouth. You have sadness, which is seen primarily in the mouth and the cheeks, where you have that downturned mouth and those kind of sad looking eyes. And then you have fear, which is in the eyes and the mouth primarily, where you kind of have these wide sort of scared looking eyes, and you have this mouth that is kind of open, but not like open in the way that you are when you're smiling or you're interested. So that's like in studying these and looking at all these images of babies where she came up with these 10 base emotions. Okay, and our other psychologist who's famous for studying the experience of emotion is Robert Plutchik. And he really focused on the evolutionary purpose of emotions rather than like Carol Izard's method of studying infants. And so he hypothesized that emotions had an evolutionary basis, and based on that theory, he identified 8 basic emotions, so, a few less than Carol Izard, and he connected each of those emotions to an evolutionary drive, so something that would help us to survive, adapt, or reproduce, as always when we talk about evolutionary psychology. And the 8 basic emotions he came up with were fear, anger, joy, disgust, anticipation, surprise, and sadness. And the big thing, like under Robert Plutchik, like you want to know about the evolutionary basis. And then on the next slide, I'm going to show you the evolutionary drive that he connected to each of the 8 basic emotions. While you don't need to memorize those, it would be a good idea to write down like a couple of examples. So when he talks about the fear emotion, he says that the evolutionary drive is to help us stay out of danger. That fear would, keep us away from a tall cliff or a scary animal or something like that. Anger helps us to defend ourselves. You need to feel like angry in order to want to fight somebody. Joy obviously helps with reproduction. You want to feel happy and excited if you are, going down that road. Disgust, as we've talked about a little bit in the past, it really helps you to stay away from certain foods. So we talked about novel taste avoidance earlier in this unit and how humans tend to avoid the taste of bitter. And most evolutionary psychologists believe that that is because a lot of poisonous foods in the wild, like poisonous berries and mushrooms, taste bitter. So that the disgust that we feel has this evolutionary foundation to help us stay away from things that are harmful to us. Anticipation and surprise are a little bit similar. They both deal with alertness. Anticipation is kind of connected to like being on watch, like waiting for something to happen. So you have this alertness and this readiness, whereas surprise is usually connected a little bit more to like joy or like happiness. So it's more of like an interest and alertness. Sadness helps you to feel empathy and connect with others. And, as we've talked a lot when we get into evolutionary psych, like one of the foundational ideas of evolutionary psychology is the idea of community and belonging to a group, and how belonging to a group will help the entire group survive. And sadness, Plutchik thought, was a way to make that group sort of more connected, that you would feel empathy for your fellow group members and, want to support them. And then, sorry about the dog, you have acceptance, which, accepting things that you can change, or accepting something that makes you angry, or accepting something that makes you scared. It allows you to let go of those emotions and focus on something else that's more important. So, if there is kind of this looming fear, like winter is coming and we don't have enough food yet. If you spend all of your time being afraid and thinking about this fear, you're going to struggle to move past that and like try to deal with the situation. So by accepting that the fear is there, you can like kind of move past it a little bit and get into the problem solving mode. And then based on this, Plutchik came up with what we call the wheel of emotions. So here, in this sort of inner ring, you have your emotions here that he identified, okay? And then as you move one layer in, they get a little bit more intense. So you have anger turning into rage, you have anticipation turning into vigilance, joy into ecstasy, disgust into loathing, sadness into grief. And as you move outwards on the wheel, they become less intense. So disgust becomes boredom, anger becomes annoyance, anticipation becomes interest, joy, serenity, etc. And then these emotions here, sort of in the in-between areas, are the combinations of emotions. So you have a combination of fear and surprise, which is going to give you awe, like once you come out here, versus you have surprise and sadness, which gives you disapproval. You have sadness and disgust. You have anger and disgust, which breeds contempt. Anger and anticipation makes you aggressive. Anticipation and joy gives you optimism. Joy and trust or acceptance gives you love. So he kind of built that as his wheel of like understanding how emotions are combined and how they fit together in different ways to give us like the full spectrum of emotions that we experience on a daily basis. So that is all kind of our evolution. That's like our foundations of like what we know to be true about our physiological response when we're experiencing emotions. Here are the different theories about how emotion works. Here are the different theories about what emotions exist naturally and how we combine them. So that's where we're going to stop for today. The second thing we're going to look at next week is going to be looking at individual emotions and what areas of the brain, like individual emotions, will activate and why, and kind of taking a deeper look at just a few different emotions. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I hope you all have a really wonderful day.